A huge part of working in information security is about being responsive. And this is both in the sort of simple sense of responding to incidents, but also in the sense of being responsive to changes, adapting to new attacker techniques. Because if attackers keep adapting and innovating and we keep using controls from 30 years ago, they're going to eat our lunch. The problem, though, is that I feel it has become really hard to differentiate between being responsive and being reactive. And I think this is largely because of the sort of the nature of the way that large events propagate through the industry and kind of reverberate through the industry. So it feels like we're kind of just going from one crisis to the next, right? We have SolarWinds, and then we have Exchange, and then we have the next one, and we rarely get a sense to really be proactive. My name is Sander Vinberg. I'm a threat research evangelist with F5 Labs. And what I'm going to do today is present some of the findings from the 2021 Application Protection Report. And the Application Protection Report is part of a research series that is designed to sort of get over this reactivity problem by looking at attacks and looking at the attack landscape in a longer time frame over an entire calendar year, and trying to get away from the sense of, oh, this entire vulnerability is sweeping the field, and instead give people a very precise sense of, if you represent this kind of target, then you are likely to be attacked in this specific way. I should also say that this today is the first time that I'm presenting any of the findings from this 2021 report. The report is not out yet. It's coming out on Tuesday. So you all are literally the first folks that are seeing any of this work outside my team. So I'm really excited to be here. I hope that you guys find it as valuable as I think it is. So very briefly, I'm going to start by talking about some of the methods, some of the caveats that arise from the methods that we use for our analysis. I'm going to briefly run over what the threat landscape looked like in the 15 years from 2006 to 2019, and then use that to get a sense of how things changed in 2020 and what the 2020 threat landscape looked like. We're going to take a slightly deeper dive and look at some detailed attack chain analysis for the attacks that led to breaches in 2020 and get a sense of kind of how the attacks unfolded over time. I want to briefly cover some structural shifts that I believe are driving risk as a result of changes in application architecture. We're going to talk about some tactical recommendations for mitigating the risks that we saw in the breaches. And then I'm going to close with some kind of broader conclusions about the direction of the field. So if any of you have ever seen me or my boss, Ray, present the application protection report before, you might know that one of our most valuable data sources comes from a sort of unusual place, which is these letters that we all get in the mail that are like kind of frustrating, right? We get these things when there's been a data breach, because this is a data breach notification or a disclosure. And organizations send these to customers, and also in the US to the US state attorneys general when there's been a data breach. And last year, 10 states in 2019, 10 states, in 2020, 9 states were publishing all the disclosures they got on the web for people to consume. And for several years, what my team and I have been doing is scraping all these letters off the web and reading them all manually and categorizing these as attacks in different forms. And despite the fact that these things are extraordinarily low in detail, and to kind of give you a sense of how low in detail they are on an individual level, the one that we're showing here, you can see this red sentence that we highlighted that says the unauthorized access involved the insertion of rogue code into our checkout page. As far as these things go, that's actually a pretty detailed disclosure. That's about as good as we tend to get in this field. So they're very low on detail, and we'll see some of the limitations that brings into our analysis a little bit later. But there are two reasons why we think this is valuable. The first is that if you collect enough of these, you can start to recognize some trends, even despite the low amount of detail, that other people don't necessarily pick up. And we've had the opportunity to sort of bring trends to the fore that other folks didn't recognize because they weren't looking at it in this particular way. And so with that in mind, last year we had 1,025 unique incidents. The previous year we had 763 unique incidents. This year, unfortunately, our research time got cut short. I got pulled into a couple other projects. And so it was strictly just a matter of human time and budgeting, but we only had a chance to look at 729 unique incidents primarily pulled from the 2 states with the strictest reporting requirements. So while we don't have quite as many events as we did last time, we also had fewer dupes than we've had in the past. So hopefully it represents a sufficiently rich data set. But the other reason why we think that this is really valuable is that every single event represented in this data set is a successful breach. So I think in a field where it can be a little bit difficult to differentiate over a large, I mean, when we're talking about a specific event, it's pretty clear. There's an incident, it was a breach, it was an attack, it's an exploit. But when we talk about the entire field, it can be a little hard to tell the difference between attack traffic that's getting peeled off by a WAF versus attack traffic that's actually resulting in material losses for companies. So one of the strengths of this data source is that we know that all these resulted in serious losses. One of the other things that we need to talk about in terms of methodology is that this year, for the first time in this project, we started incorporating the MITRE attack framework into our research. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. Most folks are kind of familiar with it on the level that they looked at it a little bit, and then they said, this is really complicated, I better come back to this later, unless you're actually doing analysis of specific, unless you're working in a SOC and doing analysis. But normally the attack framework is not used for large N analysis like what we've done here. So you'll see as we get into it that we had to make a couple adaptations to the model. We had to add a few things that are not represented in this model. So it's definitely an adapted framework. So if any of y'all are listening and you're looking at this and thinking that is not how the attack framework works, we definitely had to bend it a little bit to make it fit our data. But there's a few things I just want to make sure are clear. And the most important is just that within this framework, tactics and techniques these are technical terms that mean something very specific. So when we're talking about tactics, we're talking about why an attacker is doing a particular thing, what they're trying to accomplish. And so that's that row of behaviors at the top that says discovery, lateral movement, collection, command and control. These are the tactics. And the techniques are how they accomplish those goals. So when we're talking about the collection tactic, we could be talking about audio capture, automated collection, clipboard data, et cetera. These are the techniques that ladder up to that tactic. And that'll become clear because we'll be differentiating analysis based on tactics and techniques a little bit later on. But with all that said, let's start by just kind of looking at what the entire breach landscape looks like and how we can tell that things have changed between 2019 and 2020. So what you see here is 3 consecutive years of analysis of this same data breach source that we were just talking about. And then on the far left, we have from a previous research project that my team did, 12 years of breach data from this separate research project that unfortunately is a slightly different data model, but kind of gives us a sense of the broad trends going here. And so there's a few things that we need to kind of pull out and conclude from this. The first is that from 2006 to 2017, the single largest driver of data breaches was web exploits. And this other category that we're just here calling access, which really means kind of any of the various attack vectors that would result in an account takeover, which essentially is credential stuffing, brute force, pass-through spraying, dictionary attacks, as well as social engineering attacks like phishing to gain stolen credits, that sort of stuff. That's what we mean when we talk about access attacks. So web exploits constitute a significantly larger proportion of breaches from 2006 to 2017 than access attacks did. By 2018, and this continued into 2019, access attacks had gone up significantly, kind of hovering right around 50% of the breaches that we looked at. And web exploits shrunk from 19% in both of those years. We also see a significant number of accidents in physical security, which I think are actually really interesting and often hilarious. But that's not really the focus of this project, which is focused on application security. So we're going to kind of leave those aside for the moment. But I want you to keep an eye on the next one up there, which is malware, because when we look at 2018, we look at 2019, it looks like a relatively stable pattern. And then all of a sudden in 2020, malware has exploded, and also third-party compromise has exploded. In this case, in 2020, the reason why the third-party compromise is so large is that there were, I think, 143 notifications that were sent out from 143 unique organizations that were all a direct consequence of a single ransomware data breach at a cloud provider called Blackbot. And they're going to come up time and time again, and they sort of are skewing our data. We found that there was like really no honest way to present this as a ransomware breach as opposed to a third-party breach, just because the system in question was under Blackbot's control and they were the ones who were breached. So we had to represent it as a third-party breach, but every time for the purposes of this talk, when you're seeing the third-party compromise in 2020, you should think that's a big chunk of ransomware. So essentially what we're looking at is between those that we know that we're counting as malware in here and those that we're counting as third-party breaches, we've seen this huge explosion in ransomware. Meanwhile, web exploits are kind of still hovering around 14-15%, and access took a big dip. So whereas 52% of the breaches that we looked at in 2019 were access breaches, one form or another, is just about 34% by the time we got to 2020. And like we mentioned, like I mentioned earlier, what we try to do with this project is give people a sense of how different target attributes ladder up to risk. And so one of the things that everybody wants to know is kind of how does my sector, how does my business model play into this? And so in 2018, and even more so in 2019, what we started to see was a really strong pattern of bifurcation based on kind of sector, but really more accurately on data types, on what kind of assets were being stolen. And so what we found was that for retail organizations and any organization that was acting in a retail-like way, by which I mean they're taking payment cards over the internet, these kinds of organizations were disproportionately more likely to be compromised by a web exploit, specifically a formjacking attack, which is the sort of broader category that includes mage cart style attacks. So injection of a malicious script that runs on the client side and exfiltrates payment card data when you try to check out a shopping cart. That's what we mean when we talk about formjacking. So the vast majority, 87% or 7 out of 8 of the web exploits that we saw in 2019 were formjacking, and the retail industry, 85% of the retail breaches were this kind of web exploit. At the other end of the spectrum, we had organizations like CPAs and law firms that had no web breaches at all, but had this enormous emphasis on access breaches, with up to 80% of the breaches in the accounting sector being attributable to some kind of access breach. So what we see is this kind of growing bifurcation where if you have payment cards that are traversing your perimeter constantly, you're going to be compromised by a web attack. And if you have other kinds of information that are stored deeper in your network in a hardened database somewhere, then account takeover for the purposes of moving laterally is kind of the name of the game. So essentially we saw these two different styles of attack depending on what kind of data people had. And this whole thing was like a nice, neat pattern. And in 2020, the pattern kind of got thrown out the window, at least on the surface. And so what we see here, and I should also say apologies, I know the categories for these sectors are different. This year for this project, we went over and adopted the formal North American Industrial Classification System, the NAICS system, and it has a lot of pros. The downside is that it's a little bit harder to compare apples to apples with previous years, and we kind of felt that it was worth it. So apologies for that. But what we see here is that the retail sector is still being pretty heavily targeted by web exploits, but not as sort of single-mindedly as it was in 2018. We are still seeing access breaches in the retail trade, which was pretty rare in the previous year. And other sectors like finance, like the professional, scientific, and technical services, which includes law firms and CPAs, among others, as well as a number of sort of tech consultants and individual contributors in the tech industry. They had this overwhelming emphasis on access attacks, which is, again, unsurprising. That would be the best way to compromise a CPA firm if I was going to do that. But at the same time, you can see with all this, the sort of bright purple and then the dark purple as well, that malware and third-party data loss also just sort of took this overwhelming growth. And again, this sort of reflects the fact that ransomware went from only 6% or so in 2019 to 34% of the breaches that we saw in 2020. And so really on the surface, it looks like our sort of neat pattern of web exploits for payment card data and access against everybody else. It kind of looks like the pattern isn't holding anymore. But this is also clear. It also makes it clear that we need to kind of dig into this a little more, because malware is not an intrusion method, right? Malware needs to be dropped somehow, it needs to be delivered. And so this was a big part of why we decided that we had to stop looking at breaches as single point events, and we had to start getting a sense of them as attack chains. And so what we're going to do now is, this is the part we're going to bring in the MITRE attack framework, and we're going to start to get a little bit more rigorous about how we classify all the separate attacker behaviors that actually lead to a breach. So what you see here is a representation of 729 different data breaches that happened in the US in 2020, represented in 4 different stages using the attack framework. And again, you're going to see a handful of things in here that don't exist in the traditional attack framework, like physical breaches, malicious insiders, data stolen from third-party accidents. Those are all additions that we made to modify the model. You will also notice that there is a lot that's unknown here. And so again, when we were kind of configuring this attack framework to work as our data model, we had to make a few decisions. One was that we were going to sort of just truncate all the attack chains at 4 stages. We only had 1 or 2 events that had a larger number of stages. And we felt that it didn't add so much as it just added extra complexity. But the other thing about this is that we felt that the attack framework had, because it has this differentiation between tactic and technique, it allowed us to capture tactics even when we didn't know what the technique was. And so even if we weren't able to sort of map every single technique in every single stage, we could still get a sense of why were attackers trying to do what they were trying to do. And so what you'll notice here, if you kind of pick out the light yellow, the sort of like cream butter colored lines, those all represent unknown vectors, right? And so there are kind of 2 unknowns that we need to look out for. One is the unknown techniques that are kind of at the back of that roller coaster on the top, that represent, okay, we know that there was initial access as a tactic, but we don't know what the technique was. And we know that execution was a tactic in stage 2, but we don't know how, et cetera. So what was initially designed in the attack framework to sort of capture all this rigor, we ended up using as a way to sort of get around uncertainty within our data. So it is clear that there's a lot that we don't know. And you know, I realize that the breach notifications that we consume for this purpose, they're not written for security researchers like us. They're written for, well, primarily for consumers and secondarily for lawyers and regulators. But this partly just illustrates how much better we could do, how much lost opportunity there is for professional to professional communication about how people are actually getting attacked. Because if we could fill in all the unknowns here and add all the necessary stages, we would be able to control risk as a field a lot better. But it also, all these unknowns kind of illuminate another problem, which is that many of the disclosures we look at don't tell us anything about the vector, and they only tell us about a single impact, which is business email compromise. And in all of the various ways that we have represented these data so far, whether we're looking at the attack chains or whether we're looking in the sort of single point analysis we had earlier, none of those are able to sort of capture an unspecified business email compromise. So we also added this 3rd way of using non-exclusive tags in a flat structure. So we could say, just show me all the breaches that included some kind of web exploit, some kind of ransomware, some kind of third-party breach. And by doing so, a number of the unknowns that you see here that just sort of start in the unknown and then terminate at the end, and we don't know a single thing about them, most of these, about I want to say 27% of these were some form of business email compromise. And while it is very difficult to control the likelihood of business email compromise, it is a lot easier to control the impact, because we all sort of have become habituated to using email as unstructured, messy cloud storage. I mean, I do it. I think everybody does it. We get an email from someone with a paper we're supposed to read or with a document we're supposed to look over, and we archive it and say, I'll get that attachment later. We all do it. And what that means is that when there is an account takeover event or someone achieves persistence and gets a lot of email inboxes, they are eventually able to mine that. It might not always be useful to them, but it sure does provoke a breach disclosure and some kind of investigation. Okay, so if then we strip away all the stuff from that previous diagram that is not related to application security, so if we get rid of the ones that are just go from unknown to end, which we suspect are some kind of business email compromise, and we get rid of the accidents, physical breaches, insiders, that sort of thing, and we just focus on application risks, This is kind of what the entire breach landscape looks like for 2020, based on, again, 729 incidents that we looked at. There's a lot to dig into here. I could spend all day looking at this. And in fact, I frequently do these days. And I'm going to sort of break down each stage a little bit later. So I'm not going to dig too much into this now, but one thing that we can do from this is we can start to get a sense of what are the most prevalent tactics and techniques across all 4 stages. And so what emerges here when we just sort of do the counts is, well, I mean, the most obvious one is that initial access is present in more than 90% of the events we looked at, which is not super surprising, given that you kind of need initial access to do a lot of the others that we're talking about. The only other ingress method that we're talking about is credential access, which you see here, which leads to, in terms of techniques, a small amount of things identified as brute force, a slightly larger number of things identified as credential stuffing, also the use of unsecured credentials in 1 or 2 cases. But the vast majority of the things that we're looking at here began with initial access. Now, I actually think that a large proportion of the initial access in stage 1 tactic that is going to an unknown technique, I think if we had more information, we would conclude that these are probably credential stuffing events. We know from prior research, including the report that my team just published a few months ago, the credential stuffing report, that credential stuffing is both an impactful and a highly prevalent attack technique. And so the fact that it's so underrepresented here, and the fact that credential access is sort of hanging out down here at 8% or so, I think more speaks to the difficulty of capturing that than I don't think we should be concluding that credential stuffing is not a prevalent technique. Anyway, after initial access, we have exfiltration and execution, both of which were present in both of the significant sort of highly prevalent attack chains we saw, which were those leading to ransomware and those leading to formjacking and payment card exfiltration. When you see that next one that says impact, for the purposes of this talk, for this research project, you should think ransomware, because there are many attack techniques in the framework that are all part of the impact tactic. But for the purposes of this project, the only impact that ever showed up, the only one that's represented in our data, is data encrypted for impact. So you should be thinking ransomware when you see that. So when we boil this down and we do the count by techniques instead of tactics, here we start to get a slightly clearer picture of kind of what is front of mind for attackers. So you can see the single most prevalent technique, data encrypted for impact. Again, that's ransomware. After that, we have web exploits, the use of command and scripting interpreters. That is essentially the execution stage for the malicious scripts that is being injected in a mage card style formjacking attack. We have automated exfiltration. That's also a prevalent stage in a formjacking attack, followed by a number of different access attack techniques: phishing, credential stuffing, lateral movement through phishing, phishing with link, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to briefly dive into each one of the stages, because I think it can be really valuable to get a sense of kind of when attackers are looking to do different things. So we've already touched on stage 1 a little bit, but it was an eye chart before. I've zoomed it out, slightly bigger text. Maybe this will be a little bit more readable for you all. But again, so we see the vast majority of these attack chains are starting with initial access as opposed to going in through creds. I think that this is underrepresented, but we don't know. We got to work with kind of what we're presented here. And after that, a significant number of the initial access ones, the actual technique is unknown. But when we get to stage 2, we can see that execution is by far the most prevalent objective in stage 2. So once attackers are getting a foothold, they're looking to run something. In some cases, it's a script. In other cases, we don't know. Most of those execution with an unknown technique in stage 2, most of those are going to be the ransomware malware that we don't know if it was executed by a user execution through an attachment or with a dropper or what. Again, sort of points to the limitations of using the data breach notifications. In stage 3, at this point, we start to see heavy emphasis on exfiltration. We'll sort of talk about this in terms of how ransomware techniques are evolving, or ransomware sort of approaches, I guess I should say, because techniques is a technical term. But this is significant because, again, in the same way that the ransomware and the formjacking attacks are sort of bifurcating in terms of techniques. They're still the same in terms of tactics. So in the same way that both of these different attack chains were looking for one or another form of execution in stage 2, at this point, they're looking for one or another form of exfiltration to get the data out of the environment. Much of the exfiltration we're seeing, especially the web exploit based stuff, is automated. But we occasionally see exfiltration of cloud storage, exfiltration over existing web services, as well as, like we noted, a large number of just unknowns of nulls in the data. By stage 4, at this point, any of the ransomware attacks that haven't flipped the switch and actually put the encryption in place, this is when they're going to do it, which again, we'll touch on that in a moment in terms of how ransomware techniques are evolving. But you can also see there's a small number of attack chains in here that haven't achieved exfiltration at this stage yet for various reasons. Some of this just boils down to differences in detail, because some of the notifications we saw were saying things like, okay, it was a brute force against RDP, and then using brute force against a VPN, and then brute forcing an RDP terminal once they're connected to the VPN, et cetera, et cetera. So by the time they get to stage 4, now they're ready for exfiltration. Okay, so I just alluded to this, which is a sort of evolution in terms of how ransomware is working. And I think that it both is sort of both a cause and a consequence of how much more popular ransomware is right now. Because for a long time, like when I first got into this field 15 years ago, ransomware was the sort of thing that we felt was, if not a solved problem, then largely a managed problem, in the sense that it was there to separate those people that had a good backup strategy as part of their incident response and those who didn't have a good backup strategy. Or to put it another way, those who actually practiced their backup strategy and really did it every single day, and those that checked the box, said they did it and didn't really do it. What has changed is that attackers are now, well, two things. One is that they're waiting much longer before they actually run the encryption part of their attack. And so they are taking their time, they're achieving persistence, they are making sure that the ransomware has access or is in a location where it can encrypt everything in the network before they're flipping the switch. If any of you guys had to deal with ransomware over the past year, you probably know that it has turned into sort of every operator's worst nightmare. Because it used to be that once you detected it, if you knew what the signs were, maybe you could get ahead of it, even if you just had to pull the plug and prevent your entire network from going down. That has become much harder because attackers have this approach that is more tailored toward dwell time. The other adaptation that attackers have made in ransomware is to exfiltrate data first for added leverage. So probably you guys have seen stuff about this in the news. In fact, just this week, there is a police department in the United States that is negotiating to get their data back from some Russian cyber attackers because there's a bunch of sensitive personnel files about cop misconduct in there. So what they're doing is they're exfiltrating data first in order to have something to bargain with. And so it gives, like I said, it's added leverage. And so they say, if you don't comply within 48, 72 hours, we're going to start posting all your sensitive information on the dark web. And so this is a big part of why folks are finding it so much harder to sort of come to these negotiations with ransomware attackers and come out of it looking even remotely good. And so the thing is that it's kind of difficult to get a sense of how this relates to other attacks. Like as we pointed out, ransomware is not an intrusion method. It needs to be dropped somewhere. And so unfortunately, we still don't know how most of the ransomware attackers are getting into these environments. But because we know that it's not an intrusion event, it starts to become possible for us to sort of fit this into the model, the pattern we had between web exploits against payment card information and access attacks against everyone else. Because what we are starting to think is that the primary innovation for ransomware isn't necessarily in its malware itself. That this represents a monetization strategy for data that are actually very inherently hard to sell, for sort of, you can think of as less fungible data, right? Because if you're stealing payment card information, if you're stealing credit cards, you can turn around and sell those in a day and you'll get a pretty good return on your investment. But if you're stealing employment information, if you're stealing social security numbers, if you are just dumping email boxes to look for sensitive information. That's not exactly fungible in the same way. You can't just sort of post that and find 100,000 buyers in a day. But there is one buyer who is always extremely motivated to get their hands on the data that just got stolen, and that's the victim, right? And so the real point here is that ransomware is not a new third pattern. What ransomware is an adaptation of the attack patterns against these sort of non-fungible data sources to turn them into a fungible data source by finding the perfect buyer. And that really hinges, the encryption and the exfiltration is all sort of part of the process of turning the person who used to own that data into someone who very, very much wants to own that data again. That, I think, is the most productive way to think about ransomware. It's not new. It's sort of the painful twist in monetizing poorly fungible data that are stolen. Okay, so the other really prevalent vector that we've been talking about is formjacking, and I want to make sure that everybody's sort of clear on what I mean by that, so I'm not just sort of throwing around this arbitrary term. So formjacking is, again, MageCart is the most prevalent sort of subtype or example of this kind of attack, and it is essentially the injection of a malicious script into a software platform that's running some sort of payment card processing in order to exfiltrate payment card information. I'll show you kind of what the anatomy of that attack looks like in a moment. But one of the most significant things is that we saw in 2019 that more and more organizations that didn't consider themselves retail organizations, like universities, were being compromised this way. In 2020, this became very, very clear because there was a whole campaign against professional advocacy organizations like bar associations, the New York State Bar Association or New York City Bar Association, I'm not sure, and the Los Angeles County Bar Association both got hit with formjacking attacks against member renewal payments, right? So it's like the sort of thing, you go to the bar association and it's like you got to renew your membership if you want to keep working as a lawyer. That payment card processing got formjacked against both of those, as well as a Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics. A number of trade unions also got hit in their member renewal payment card processing. So the point is that we were saying in 2019, we had this sort of catchphrase that if you act like retail, you get attacked like retail. That has become even more clear now that formjacking is not about e-commerce, it's about payment cards. And so again, don't let the sector distract you from what really matters to attackers. We're also seeing that it's going to hit smaller organizations comparatively harder, both in the sense that chargeback fees are going to hit smaller organizations harder, because at least in the US, it's not the banks or the government that sort of take the hit of fraud from stolen payment cards. It is the vendors themselves. It is their responsibility to vet. So chargeback is going to hit small vendors harder, and also just both the absolute and the relative difference in security budgets is going to make it a lot easier for somebody like Zappos or Amazon to control formjacking risk than it will be for a manufacturer who's just trying to do direct sales for the first time. We're also seeing that this trend of decentralized architecture and outsourcing is going to make a lot of the evasion techniques within formjacking, of which masquerading is the most obvious, more efficacious. And in other words, that this architectural trend is making visibility more difficult for defenders. And kind of illustrate what I mean by that, here's a brief rundown of how a formjacking attack works. So if an attacker finds a vulnerability in a platform, most often in an interpreted language like PHP or JavaScript, they're able to exploit that vulnerability to inject a malicious script. Then when that script will overlay a fake input field on top of the regular input fields, so that when a customer comes and enters their payment card information into the site, the malicious script will skim that information, encrypt it, and send it off to a drop server. That's what we mean by formjacking. And the reason why formjacking is becoming a problem right now is because of this decentralization tendency. And so while it is perfectly possible to successfully execute an attack like this against the payment platform itself, it's a lot easier to compromise somebody, meaning you could go to, say, Target and try to compromise their instance of the Volusion e-commerce software, or you could target Volusion and inject the script into Volusion's code base such that every single site that makes a cross-site request to run the Volusion software at runtime, that script is going to be included. And that that third party or fourth party aspect is what makes the visibility so hard, because not all WAFs will miss it, but most WAFs are going to miss the fact that this code include has been compromised. Okay, I briefly want to talk about some architectural trends and how they're driving risk. This is stuff a lot of this we've written and published about over the last year, so you might have seen some of this before, but there are two things that we really want to highlight. And the first is tendencies in cloud incidents and cloud breaches. So we have looked at about 20 cloud breaches over the last year, and then we have some sort of open source intel about a very, very large number of other cloud incidents. And with the exception of the Blackbot incident that we've already talked about, that was a ransomware incident, essentially every single cloud thing that we've looked at over the last year or two has been down to misconfiguration of access control. And so this sort of gets down to that core issue about security in the cloud versus security of the cloud. Which was something that a lot of people were talking about when the cloud kind of first came on board. And then for a long time, it sort of felt like security of the cloud was a solved problem. You don't often hear about cloud providers having their fundamental infrastructure compromised. What we do hear about is cloud customers not recognizing that they have Elasticsearch databases out on the web with no authentication, or S3 buckets that are public, or Lambda systems whose permissions are way too open. and the problem here is not just that the boundary of responsibility between of the cloud and in the cloud is kind of fuzzy. And it's not just that it varies between cloud providers. It'd be one thing if you said, okay, when our app runs in Azure, we have to run it this way. And when our app runs in AWS, we run a different way. But it's actually, this boundary of responsibility is inconsistent between tools in the same cloud platform, so that you have to configure authentication and permissions differently for Lambda than for EC2, than for S3, than for Aurora. And this is really what makes it so hard to control configuration risk in the cloud. And so there's no real easy solution to that. And I'm not one of those folks that says put another tool onto it for configuration management, because that's another tool that itself needs to be configured. But really what we want to point to here is that the way that we've talked about cloud risk for a long time, we think is not really true to the way that risk is manifesting in the field. And finally, just very briefly, if you haven't heard about the Meow attacks, there was a point in the middle of 2020 when people were going around and just wiping unsecured cloud databases. The Meow attacks took about 15,000 unsecured cloud storage instances down by adding the word meow to the end of a bunch of file names and indices, which meant that the relational database couldn't speak to itself. After the Meow attacks kind of tapered off, somebody else was going through and did about 5,000 more cloud databases. And this person was leaving behind the name of a prominent information security provider, suspected sort of a framing attempt or something like that. So the point is that we can talk about 20 or so events, but somebody in the field, I don't know if they were a vigilante or an attacker or somebody who wanted to prove a point or what, but somebody has gone through and made an extremely strong point by wiping out lots and lots of data. So this is a very real problem. And if your application is running this way, configuration management and review and inventory in the cloud is incredibly important. Okay, also want to talk a little bit about APIs. I think it probably is clear to everybody here that API-centric architectures have become enormously popular. And it's not as though APIs are new, but building an application where the API is the fundamental glue of the application, that's a new trend. And what we're seeing is that most of the folks that are, or not most, but many of the organizations that are building applications this way don't necessarily understand all of the security ramifications. And the reason we feel pretty comfortable making that conclusion is that about 2/3 of the incidents that we've looked at over the last 3 years have been attributable to either a complete lack of access control or failed access control. And so we would argue, I mean, there are some risks that people know about and accept, but a lack of access control is not an acceptable risk. That's not something that a CISO or a CIO is going to say, I feel comfortable about this, right? So the point is that these are vulnerabilities, these are configurations that are getting out in the wild and people aren't finding out about it until too late, which is a completely different form of risk, right? So it is based on this that we feel comfortable saying that the implications of building an entire app around APIs are still not well understood, even though APIs themselves are decades old. Okay, briefly want to talk about some tactical recommendations. I'm going to be going very fast here because I'm kind of running out of time. So I'll just say ahead of time, if anybody really wants to dive into this and kind of pick apart the control recommendations, please get in touch with me after the thing. I'd love to talk about this some more. So what I'm going to do is present 3 different rankings of controls based on different metrics. And so the first metric here is by what we're calling depth, which is the number of time, the frequency of the corresponding attack technique that this would mitigate based on the attack chain analysis that we showed you guys earlier. And based on that, the extraordinary prevalence of ransomware means that data backup kind of comes up to the fore. So if you just wanted to control the single vector that caused the most damage in 2020, it would be a data backup strategy. Even though, as we were talking about with evolution of ransomware, backup is not the silver bullet for ransomware, but it's still a really good place to start. After that, reflecting the sort of prevalence of web exploits, we have application isolation and sandboxing, exploit protection in the form of a WAF, network segmentation, and then the privileged account management is sort of covering a lot of these different vectors in the sense of restricting admin permissions and stuff like that. If we sort not by depth, but by breadth, in the sense of how many different attack techniques in the entire data set would be mitigated by a specific control, we get a completely different list, right? And so at this point, in terms of selecting for coverage, what we have is restricting web-based content in the form of, that can take the form of security headers, it could take the form of restricting extensions or scripting. User training, I have to admit, I'm a little bit unimpressed by this one because I think it's a lot easier said than done. It's actually a lot harder to move the needle in terms of user training. But then we have multi-factor authentication, which I think reflects the fact that there were a very large number of access attack techniques, none of which had a super high level of prevalence in the data, but each, like when you add them all up together, it adds up to a fair amount of damage. And then finally, what we did was we sort of multiplied depth by breadth to get an overall coverage for a blended ranking. And we sort of joke and call it the arbitrary effectiveness coefficient because it's a totally dimensionless value. It has no significance outside of this table, but still it gives us kind of a sense of what is the overall holistic recommended control. And again, it's a totally different list. So at the top, we have privileged account management, so restricting admin permissions. Then network segmentation, which I think reflects the fact that all of these attacks sort of are predicated on some degree of moving things around. After which we have web-based content, user training, and network intrusion prevention. Okay, very briefly, I'm going to cover a few strategic conclusions, things that sort of emerge about the direction of the field based on this analysis. The first is something I've alluded to a little bit here, which is that we should always be very clear about the sort of comparative precision of any sort of target parameter in terms of predicting risk, right? And so it is so common in our field to really get fixated on sectors and sectoral risk firmographics. But if you have information about what kind of data a target organization or your organization is working with, that's much more predictive, right? And the bar associations that are getting hit with formjacking, that's the best example, right? Because nobody thinks a bar association is like a retail org, but they just got hit that way, right? So similarly, if you know what kind of software an organization is running, that's more precise than data. If you know about open vulnerabilities, that's more precise than software, et cetera, right? So the point is, don't ever throw out more precise targeting information in favor of less precise targeting information. I also feel sort of obliged to point out, I am not an opponent of cryptocurrencies, and I'm definitely not an advocate for the fiat currency system, but I'd sort of have to point out that if we look at ransomware primarily as a monetization strategy, cryptocurrencies are a big pillar that make that vector really work. And so I don't really care either way what happens with cryptocurrencies, but I think we need to understand that this is part of the picture. I would like to kind of just reiterate that APIs, even REST APIs, are not a protocol and they're not a standard. It's best thought of as a way to think about a problem and nothing more. which means that the practices and the protocols that are emerging as de facto standards, like OAuth 2.0, like OpenID Connect, like JSON Web Tokens, these should be treated. I think that in the absence of anything else, we need to embrace these and make them as close to standards as we can. Anybody bringing an API to market these days should basically not try to homebrew and should embrace these to the greatest degree possible. All right, so my team and I exist solely for the purpose of doing this kind of research and bringing it to folks like you guys. So we really thrive on feedback. So if you want to talk this over more, if you have questions, I glossed over a ton of information very, very quickly here. So I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to talk it over some more. Please be in touch. And thanks very much. I appreciate it. I don't know. I just realized we do have maybe a few minutes for some questions. If anyone has any questions, alternatively, I'm just going to drop my mail here. Yeah, please be in touch if you ever have any questions. It's been a huge pleasure. And thanks again. Take care. Oh, wait, here's a question. Do I recommend having a store of cryptocurrency as a mitigation control? This is a tough one. I understand that a lot of folks are basically letting the cyber insurance companies handle this, in the sense that the insurance companies have dedicated negotiators. They can sort of handle the transaction of the cryptocurrency. So I'm not against keeping some cryptocurrency around, but I'm not sure I would consider it a super valuable way to invest that money. The flip side of it is I don't know what the laws are like in Canada. In the US, the Department of Treasury is really trying to crack down on people paying ransomware to known state-sponsored actors, right? So if your ransomware attackers are from North Korea or Iran or China, or in some cases Russia, you can actually get in trouble for paying these folks, and which really puts people kind of between a rock and a hard place. So ransomware response is a really tricky thing. I'm not sure I would recommend working with an insurance company, but I'm not sure I know an alternative either. I think I would put my money into malware protection before I bought some cryptocurrency, but that's also because I would be worried about the risk of the cryptocurrency market falling out from under me while I was holding on to it. All right, well, thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.